I'm really, really happy and delighted actually to be here, not just because I'm getting an honorary doctorate, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'm very grateful to everyone who has been behind the whole process, but because coming to Jönköping is always a pleasure. Great people, great environment, great atmosphere. You might not know, but when you go elsewhere, you lighten up congresses. And this is something that everyone appreciates from the people that are here. So I'm really, really happy. And by the way, my daughter thinks that Jönköping is the absolute best place in the world. So she's at the moment thinking that she wants to come and do her undergraduate here. She's still a bit young, but nevertheless, that's a possibility. The topic I'm going to be talking to see if I deserve this honorary doctorate is about one of the topics I've been working for the most part over the last few years, which is the role of institutions and institutions, government quality, and regional inequality. Why do I work on this? Well, there's a problem. My interest has been for quite some time in trying to analyze why there's territorial inequality, why some places, some cities, some regions, some towns, some localities are much more developed than others. And that links me to the work done by a lot of economists on growth theory. And when we look at growth theory, mainly my main preoccupation, like that of many economists, let's say economic geographers, sociologists, has been how can we generate more growth and more and better quality jobs? And for many, many years, we thought we had the solution. You had to look at the mainstream theories coming from the 1950s. So it was very simple. You had to intervene on three areas. One was physical capital, mostly proxied by infrastructure. So you build more infrastructure, and by building more infrastructure, you would be better off. And then more recently, you would combine it with greater investment in skills, in training, in education, human capital, but also much greater investment in science and technology innovation. When you put all those things together, you would explain the majority of why do places grow, why do places grow less, why do places create more employment, and also why is there such a difference between more advanced, more developed areas and less developed areas. There was always a part that we didn't know, which is this question mark, which in our jargon we call either the residual factor or the error term. But we were happy that with the three key elements, we could explain virtually everything. What has happened over the last 3 decades, over time? Well, what has happened is that we have better data, we have better models, we have much better methods, we have better theories, but we explain much less. So we know less, or we're less confident than we were just 30 years ago. And you can see the returns of our investment in infrastructure, of our human capital, of our innovation, is much less than it was before. If you go to Italy and you plug all these three factors into any sort of analysis, you explain absolutely nothing, and what we don't know has grown. So we have been working with policies that, especially in the case of the European Union, for development, that with caveats have worked. They seem to have been improving in their returns, but nevertheless, we have seen that specific interventions in terms of, let's say, building better roads or putting more money into specific types of, let's say, human capital innovation, seem to have been yielding lower returns, having less of an impact. And I'm going to put some examples. And since I don't want to offend anyone, I normally offend a lot of people when I do presentations, I'm going to take examples from my country of origin, which is, as you can see from my name, Spain. And Spain is, after Portugal, the country with the best road infrastructure in the world right now. Portugal is by quite some margin. If you compare it, the endowment of, let's say, roads and motorways in Portugal, in comparison to the UK, where I work, you have that the density is 6 times higher than in the case of the UK. but Portugal hasn't been growing for the last 20 years. It's starting to do a bit better, but it's taking a long time. Why? Because much of the investment that has taken place doesn't make that much economic or social sense. I'm going to put quite a few examples from Spain. In Spain, for quite some time, we have fought, as it was getting a medal, to be the country with the biggest network of high-speed rail. And for a moment, we were. So first it was those pesky French, always our neighbors, our hated neighbors in a way. We get along very well, but nevertheless, that had more, so we had to overtake them. Now we've been overtaken by the Chinese. Of course, you cannot compare the dimension of Spain with the dimension of China, but nevertheless, we are still the second in the world, first in terms of density per population, per size of the country, per GDP. But what you have is a lot of stations like this one. And this is not in the middle of nowhere. This is a station in the Expo in Seville, which was opened for the first time in April 1992 and has seen one high-speed train, namely when the King and Queen of Spain at that time went to the Expo to open the Expo, and that was it. But it's not the only case. This is the equivalent of private eye in Spanish. And I'm just going to do a simple translation. The high-speed rail between Toledo, Cuenca, and Albacete, 3 small cities to the south of Madrid, has been closed 10 months after it opened. And the question is, why did they close? They put so much money. We put so much money into a high-speed network to build it. And why do we close it 10 months after it opens? Well, for a simple reason. You had 2 trains a day, average passengers per day, 1 in each direction, 9. Not 90, not 900, not 9,000, but 9 passengers for a cost of 18,000 euros per day just of maintenance of the track. Forget about the initial investment. Of course, the day the last train traveled from Toledo to Albacete, there were about 40 journalists that got into the train and interviewed the 3 passengers there, and the 3 passengers were outraged, saying, this is a public service, we have all paid for it, it shouldn't be suppressed. Of course, it's much cheaper to subsidize these people to take their private helicopter than to actually put this service there. Another one is, for example, the Ring Road. I work in London, I am from Madrid, and when you go to Madrid, you find, although now it's getting a bit worse, but nevertheless, that there are virtually no traffic jams. First, because we got one of the best public transport systems in the world. Then on top of that, we have 1 internal ring road, a 2nd internal ring road, a 3rd ring road that is going to be finished with the longest tunnel. We haven't got the money at the moment, but underneath a natural park. And then if you are into the southeast, which is the industrial part of Madrid, you have 2 half ring roads. And these are not small, tiny roads. You have 5 lanes on one side, 5 lanes on the other side. And of course, you say, why? When London is double the size in terms of population of Madrid, and yet it only has 1. Is all this needed? Of course, we have other examples, 56 airports in Spain, of which until very recently there were 7 that hadn't seen a single plane. There were 6 others that had less than 10,000 passengers per year, that is 25 passengers on average per day. And my old favorite is this one, the Ciudad Real Airport, in which you have this Spanish ghost airport that cost 1 billion to build, hadn't seen a single plane ever, and was put into auction in 2015. And the biggest bid was by a Chinese individual, and it was 10,000 euros. It's a pity that none of you knew about it, because you could have bought your own airport in Spain. You didn't do it, but that was the case. It wasn't sold by 10,000 euros. It was put into auction the year after, in 2016, and it was sold eventually for 40 million euros. But the gap between 40 million and a billion, you can make your own calculations. Of course, you're going to say, why does this happen? But it can be worse. I put the case of Spain or Portugal, but you go to Portugal, you land in Lisbon, and you look around from the plane, and what you see is motorways everywhere. Greece has received the same amount of money as Portugal over the years to invest in the same things. And in Greece, whereas the Portuguese have done 3 motorways in parallel between Lisbon and Porto that no one takes because now they are toll roads, and the national road that was built before the motorways were built is still there and takes most of the traffic. The Greeks, at the same time, have finished over a period of 40 years, it took them 40 years, just 1 motorway between Athens and Thessaloniki, and the question is, where is the rest of the money? But the same, don't look at Hugo Chavez here. This is the New York Times in 2012, and it's looking at the comparison between Italy and Spain, and saying the Salerno-Reggio Calabria, for example, motorway, 500 kilometers, so it was started in 1964, took until 2017, well, December 2016, to finish. And the costs were about 20 times what it was originally envisaged. So it can get worse. And why does this happen? Why do we get these returns? Well, there seems to be one potential factor that we have overlooked, and might be as important, if not more important, than physical capital, human capital, and innovation in determining economic and the potential of economic development. And that is institutions. So whether your investments work, whether you make a difference in terms of your human capital, your infrastructure, etc., makes a difference for creating jobs, creating greater benefits, depends very much on issues like, do you have good and efficient governments? Do you have transparent and efficient, so you have adequate rule of law? How is the level of corruption? And how transparent, how accountable, how efficient is your system? And the problem we had is that we hadn't included, not because we didn't think it was important, but because we didn't agree on what we understood by institutions, first. Second, it was very difficult. It's very difficult to measure anything, but it was very difficult to measure any type of institution. And even then, we didn't agree on what type of methods to use. Happily, and very often the answers come from Sweden, many of our colleagues at the Quality of Government Institute in Gothenburg, at the University of Gothenburg, have been working on this for quite some time, and have created, at least in the case of Europe, what I think is by far the best indicator of quality of government that we can see at a regional level. And what has become clear is that there are significant differences in quality of government across Europe. This is their last map, the one that's done for the survey in which they had more than 70,000 people interviewed across the whole of Europe for quality of government in 2017. And of course, if you're Swedish, regardless of whether you are in Malmö or in Luleå, you're okay, because you have the best quality of government in the whole of the European Union, which I would say pretty much means the best quality of government in the whole of the world. And that affects all the Nordic countries. I would say that Norway's there, although it hasn't been measured, anywhere from Denmark to Sweden to Finland, but you can see also in parts of the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Bavaria, Lower Saxony. But this is not a simple north-south, east-west divide. What you have is that the polar opposite is not the east, it's the southeast of Europe. All member states, like Italy, which, by the way, has gone in reverse, as we'll see in a moment, Greece, together with new member states like Romania and Bulgaria, that have by far the worst quality of government in Europe. And then what you have is a middle class, which mainly involves the British Isles, France, parts of Germany, parts of Belgium, and to a lesser extent, much less than 10 years ago because there has been a deterioration, the Iberian Peninsula. And this changes over time. You can see the maps, how they've been changing. There's permanence, always best in the Nordics, always worse in the southeast. But you take a look at the situation in 2009 for the Iberian Peninsula, there was virtually no difference between Portugal, Spain, and France. Now you can see how, over time, quality of government can improve, but it can also deteriorate. So it doesn't necessarily stay still. And this is one of the things that I've been working quite a lot. I've been following their example. This is the work I'm doing at the moment. This can be applied to different parts of the world. I've been working on China, measuring government efficiency at levels of cities. Don't look at the colors because blue means the more developed cities, red the less developed cities. But you can see there's a connection, the size of the circles, the more developed, you generally have better institutions. So bigger circles than if you are here in red, that is less developed. We also measure fight against corruption, and we're doing that also using Afrobarometer for the case of Africa. Unfortunately, the differences in colors doesn't appear that well in the map. It appears a bit more here, over there. And this is something that when you start putting it into our analysis, does address a large part of that big question mark that I had at the beginning. If we are not capable of knowing what is determining why some places grow more and why some places grow less, why some places create more jobs and why some places create less jobs, is because we had overlooked what was a fundamental factor behind levels of development. And this can be done both in a direct and in indirect way. I'm going to look at how institutions, and in particular quality of government, affects economic development, both directly and indirectly. And you'll see, why do you put tables? Don't put tables. No, I just want to say that there's a lot of serious research behind this. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of analysis. I wouldn't go like Xavier Sala-Martin saying, I just run 10 million regressions, I don't put my regressions in a loop. That's the difference. But nevertheless, there's a lot of work that I'm going to try to summarize very quickly into different types of results that represent the work I've been doing, and I'm going to say we a lot of times because it's not just my own work, it's work I do with a lot of teams of people that both at the LSE but also in other parts of the world work with me on these topics. And I'm going to take a look at the direct impact. If you have good institutions, then those institutions first directly affect your economic performance. They also make sure that you make good decisions about what type of investments you do. And then you have better, more balanced, better structured investments in infrastructure, human capital, and innovation. When you have weak institutions, you have first barriers for the implementation of any type of policy, for the design of good policies, for the monitoring of good policies, that affects what you can do with other types of policies, and the returns are different. You have much bigger impact when you have much greater institutions in terms of jobs and economic growth, and you have also the opposite if your quality of government, your local institutions are worse. Let me just give you some examples. For example, this is the distribution, and we have measured this for the European Union cohesion effort, the cohesion policy. This is how the money coming from the European Union is distributed between regions in the European Union. The majority get very little. There's a limited number of regions that above a certain threshold, 80 euros per year, 100 euros per year, 120 euros per year, 150, get some more money. So if you're in Paris and you get 20 euros per head per year, that doesn't make a difference. It buys you a beer, nothing else. If you are in the Azores and you get on average 400, 500 euros per head per year, that can make a difference. Because in the Azores, that represents about 60% of all public investment done by anyone in terms of investment, capital investment, not expenditure. And once you plug that into the analysis, we see and we get results in terms of that are policy relevant on how to invest. You can see that, let's say, what about if we start pumping money and you start looking at this, you put money, and this is levels of 80 euros, and you increase those 80 euros to 100 euros, and your growth increases. Both if you have areas where you spend limited amount of money or you spend a lot of money. When you go to 120, you still increase. But beyond 120, you get no returns whatsoever. The 120 is here in blue, the 150 is superimposed, so there's no addition. You put 30 euros per head more on average in a region per year in Europe, and you get no additional returns. And we had exactly the same results when we go to 200 or 250. This implies that for many areas that receive the bulk of the funding from the European Union, because they have very weak quality of government, it's much better above 80 euros, but especially you cannot go above 120 euros to put all your effort in increasing your quality of government. The returns are on average about 3 to 4 times higher by putting the same amount of effort into improving quality of government than putting more money into doing exactly the same thing. The problem is, until now, we have put 0 euros into improving quality of government, and we have always tried to say, well, let's build more roads. When you're building roads between places or ports or anything, but roads between places that have got motorways, 20,000 and 30,000 inhabitants, it's no wonder that's going to have no impact whatsoever. So you need to have more investment into addressing institutional bottlenecks that would lead to better policies and more development. I mean, you can compensate that by increasing the budget massively. But of course, then we wouldn't be able to invest in nursing, for example, or in early childhood, which are as important, if not more important, than many of the things I'm talking about here. Other impacts, employment. For example, if you have good institutions, what you have is also directly an impact on generating jobs and the different types of jobs. These jobs are highly skilled and more permanent. When you have poor institutions, the returns are very often in a lower quality of jobs, very often at levels that are barely above poverty or there, and jobs that are by and large unqualified. But on top of that, we have the indirect impact, which is something that until now has not been highlighted and has not been highlighted by most research. For example, the European Union has been obsessed for many, many years in trying to improve why are we not as innovative as the US? Why don't we generate the Googles and the Twitters of the digital economy? Why do they come from the US? So because we invest less in research and development. And we do invest a bit less. But the idea is, let's go and increase it until 3%. But when you start doing this type of analysis, and you do it at the regional level, what we find is that if you put quality of government and you plug it into the analysis, and you take a look at some output of innovation, for most of the regions in the European Union, this is standardized between 0 and 1. So if you have very poor quality of government, from 0 to 0.3, so the bottom 30% of performance, your quality of government is so bad that whatever you do, you're not going to get any sort of innovation. If you are at the top, where Sweden is, for example, you shouldn't worry too much about quality of government. When you want to do innovation, you should work about other sort of factors, because you can see the line is flat or even goes in decline. Having an excellent quality of government like these regions over here, or having a very good quality of government doesn't make that much of a difference. For the bulk of the regions in Europe, those between here, 0.3 to 0.8, so all of these regions, including many of the less developed regions here in red, putting a lot of money into research and development without increasing the quality of government leads very often to nepotism, to giving money to friends, that very often does not lead to any sort of innovation, both at the level of firms, but also at the level of public institutions and universities. However, until now, there has been no attention whatsoever in innovation policy on issues related to quality of government and the quality of the government of the places where these policies were being implemented. The same for infrastructure. So, and this is something we have analyzed in a very, very clear way, especially with Marco Di Cataldo and Riccardo Crescenzi at the LSE. The poorer the quality of your government, the more you like big projects. The pharaohs built the pyramids because they would be remembered. So you want something big. You have less opposition by your people, you have less scrutiny, so you build a lot of big ports, airports, motorways. I put one example here, the motorways. I saw the examples of Spain. The more you put into big projects, the less the outcomes. So there's less impact in terms of development, both measured by GDP growth and by employment. The better the quality of government, the more likely you are to go for projects that are not that big but address bottlenecks. So you prefer the humble secondary road to the motorway. It's not that you don't invest in motorways. If the motorway is going to solve your problem, you would invest in a motorway. But you make decisions based on what your problems are. And that leads to much, much greater sort of economic impact. So poor government quality leads to wrong decisions that very often would get economic impact in the very short term. You get returns while you're building a big project. It would get some votes and saying we had no motorway or we had no port and now we have one. But it would lead in the long and medium term to no sustainable economic outcomes. And then we have also analyzed this in different types of regions and different types of territories. The European Union has recently divided Europe into two types, the less developed regions of Europe, into two types of regions. Those in Eastern Europe that are still very, very poor, the so-called low-income regions, but have been catching up, have been growing relatively fast because they started from very low levels. And those in the south of Europe that are no longer as poor, but they're still well below the average of the European Union, but are not growing, the so-called low-growth regions. And what we find is that in these cases, because although they have very weak quality of government, because they're so far away from the frontier in terms of endowments, you need to still put resources in the basic factors. If you go to the traditional theories, and you say, let's put more money into infrastructure, more money into human capital, more money into innovation, you still get returns, and those returns allow you to grow. Having said that, there's a limit. I've been sent many times to Poland, mainly by the European Commission, to give my sort of talks, saying it doesn't make sense that you're starting to build, you have two airports in Gdansk and Gdynia International, which are 25 kilometers apart, the two cities, and the airports are even closer. So what you need to do is perhaps think about these things in a better way, because you cannot be repeating the same problems. You're going to end up with that sort of institutional problems once you have the basic endowments. And this is harsh because I come from one of these countries, and I work a lot. If you are in the south of Europe, putting any more money into innovation or into infrastructure, in most cases, doesn't make sense at all anymore with the levels of endowments that we have, unless you improve the quality of institutions. The only exception would be investing still in human capital. And this is something that is a very harsh message, because decision makers in many of these countries still like to say, well, we don't like to reform ourselves. We like to do more or less the same thing that we have done, because perhaps if we invest a lot in infrastructure, then I get more votes, and then I can go and sit in, let's say, the board of this large infrastructural company, which is, I mean, a country like Spain is the second largest power in the world today in terms of infrastructural companies. So it's a very cozy sort of situation for many, many decision makers at the quiet moment. What we are saying is what we need is a thorough reform at the institutional level in order to make those differences. This is where I've been. This is the work I've been conducting. It doesn't mean I'm going to stay still there. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and we need to go forward. So what is the way forward? The first one is we have been looking very, very much at how differences in institutional quality actually affect economic outcomes. But we know very little, and we understand very little about how institutions change over time. Many people say they never change. So if you're Greece, you're doomed. It's what Putnam was saying, the poor people in the south of Italy. This is something that happened in the Middle Ages, 7 centuries ago, and whatever you do, you're not going to be able to change it, so you're going to be doomed. The best way is to migrate. But of course, we are starting to see that quality of government can improve and can decrease. And there are plenty of examples here. I gave you an example. In the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in Spain, the quality of government over a period of 10 years had declined relatively quickly. And Spain is not the worst case. You go to many developing countries, you'll find that places like Venezuela, for example, have gone down the drain in about 30 years, but completely down the drain. In other cases, what we have is massive improvements in quality of government that make a difference. The most clear example in the case of Europe is Estonia, where quality of government and massive improvements in quality of government have made a big difference in its performance relative to another country that had very similar history, very similar conditions like Latvia, where the quality of institutions has not improved in the same way. I'll put the example of Spain, here you are. So in general, there's a lot that we need to do about why do some places improve their government quality, improve their institutions, and others don't. Second point is how does this institutional change impinge on us? But not just looking at the traditional one. I was looking at jobs, I was looking at economic growth, but how does this affect our happiness? We also see that we're starting to see that there's a very clear relationship between poor institutions and well-being of the population as a whole. We're looking also at the question of sustainability. How sustainable is the growth that is being generated? And of course, better institutions lead perhaps to a much bigger gap in sustainability than, for example, in overall economic growth. And also we're looking at, we want to start looking at resilience. Third point is to expand institutions beyond government quality. The moment we're measuring what we can measure, it's partly a question of interest, personal interest. It's a question of resources, but there are a lot of other institutions that would matter and probably matter as much as the ones we're looking at. So government efficiency, rule of law, corruption, transparency, the ones that mainstream economists are looking at, like private property, for example, and rule of law, and go into other types of institutions, like the one, for example, that Charlotte has been working for quite some time in the past, looking at tolerance and the role of tolerance in terms of, for example, making societies more capable of becoming resilient and dynamic and developed, generate trust, and how is the importance of trust. I work a lot in Norway on these issues. I had to drop all the questions about trust after a while because everyone trusts everything, the police, the government, etc. For me, coming from Spain, it was a surprise where you get 20–25% responses. Yes, we trust the government or the judiciary. You go to Norway's 96, you do it the same question 2 years later, 97, 98%. So yeah, that might make a difference. That's important. Diversity, how diversity actually makes a difference, and openness, which is an important factor. You are, in Jönköping, an international university. To what extent being an international university has an impact on the development of the whole area of the city and the whole area of Småland, and possibly this openness is at the root of a much greater capacity to create a more resilient, more dynamic, more inclusive, more sustainable economic and social environment, a more sustainable society, if you want. Understanding the mechanisms. The moment we're saying, we put this into a machine and then we get out a result and we're saying, yes, you improve this, but what are the exact mechanisms? How does it work? How having better institutions actually leads to more sustainable, more resilient, better, more dynamic from economic societies across. And we know virtually nothing. And here is where we need to go much more in detail. The case studies that were presented by my two predecessors, the types of analysis, this is something that needs to be reproduced in much greater detail than we have done until now. And the final point, and I'm glad that I only have 2 minutes because I'm finishing now, is actually going from theory and analysis to practice. We cannot just sit down in our ivory towers here at the business school, nice, very nice towers. You have to go and talk to decision makers here in Jönköping, in Stockholm, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, because this is an important factor. How do institutions affect all these outcomes, and how can we create policies that would facilitate, through better institutions, that we create more inclusive, more resilient, and far more sustainable societies from both a social and economic perspective. But this is something that, I've been trying, but I cannot do alone. I cannot even do with the extensive sort of research groups that I work with. It's something for all of us and to work on. So I would encourage all of you, if you're interested, to try to start thinking about these issues, because there's a lot of work to be done. We are still just scratching the surface, and we'll need as much brain power as we can get. First, to try to come with potential good analysis that would lead to solutions, and then as well, and this is an important role, to try to bang the drum and try to convince those that are in power that we need to approach development policies in a potentially very different way than what we have done until now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrés. Such an interesting presentation. Brings up so many questions, but I'm going to let the floor start to see if we have any questions from the audience to start with.
I wonder if you would be able to provide perhaps a concise definition of good government, because you make a very clear link with good government and the outputs. So what should I be looking for to try to have good government?
Well, here it's a very simple, very good, very incisive question, and one in which we haven't got a clear answer. How do we define good government, and how do we define good institutions? And for a long time there has been this struggle, both in terms of concept and in terms of measurement, about how do we define those two concepts. I would say good government is one that is accountable, that is transparent, that has decision makers that actually care for the interests of the collectivity rather than their own interest. But the problem is, when it comes to actually defining what it is not that simple. And for many years we have a struggle between objective measures of what a good government is and subjective measures of what a good government is. So how do you define good rule of law? And we all know what rule of law should be just. But then when it comes to measuring, first, how do we find what's just? And when it comes to measuring what's just, we have very imperfect proxies. So we say it should be that good rule of law means an independent and efficient justice system in terms of delivering verdicts, for example, in a timely manner. And then you have people like Robert Putnam that go to Italy and say, it takes 1,000 days to reach a verdict. And then you come to Sweden, it takes 200 days. Ergo, the Swedish justice is far better than the Italian justice. And people say, yes, that's probably true. But in North Korea, it takes 10 minutes to make a decision reach a verdict that you cannot go back on. So in the end, we are struggling with all that. And we should have started by your question. The problem is, since we cannot agree on that question, we have to start looking and saying, what do we do? So in the end, what has become much more common to use has been fundamentally definitions that are based on subjective perceptions of what people think is a good government. So what people are doing is using surveys and saying, to what extent do you think that your government is corrupt, and it's more efficient, etc. And that's how we reach our measurements that lead to our definitions.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very, very, very interesting lecture. I'm thinking a little bit about, is it a place for political scientists? Because institutions and government quality, with the political mess we have in Europe now, could political science, could there be more work in what you are doing by looking at how political scientists could analyze the political landscape and the shift of the years? Because would that possibly affect how institutions and government work?
Okay. Yeah, as I said in my final slide, this is something that we cannot do alone, and I don't mean we as economists. I'm not an economist, by the way, I'm a geographer. So, but I don't believe this fragmentation actually helps. We need people from very different walks of life. So, and I think that in particular political scientists have a lot to say about this. But we need to start dismantling our walls and try to start collaborating across disciplinary boundaries and saying, how is it that what you learn and what you study can help what I'm learning and vice versa? And this can be done within the social sciences, but not necessarily within the social sciences. You can expand it to whoever, because there are a lot of people, many of the best ideas coming, for example, in the field of complexity theory innovation, are coming from physicists. So we need to collaborate with as many people in as many disciplines as possible, because everyone has something to offer in terms in this sort of topic.
So I have a kind of a two-pronged question. First of all, your choice of outcome measure. Maybe it's because it's easy to measure jobs in dollars, but are those the most relevant things, particularly in light of the other prong, disruptive technologies, such as the singularity coming, the technological singularity coming, that's going to maybe completely render most of what we know as irrelevant. Not to mention, of course, what's always in the background, the climate catastrophe that's awaiting us. But these things are all obviously going to impact all this, but how are you all trying to work on these issues?
Absolutely. That's the agenda that where we're going. We started where it was easy, where people can more or less agree so everyone more or less agrees how we determine growth of GDP per head, although measuring GDP is not always the easiest part. We can measure jobs, but then the big challenge is, how do we measure well-being? How do we measure sustainability? How do we measure resilience? Because if you grow a lot for a couple of years, but then you collapse, it's useless. You want to have territories and societies that can bounce back. You want territories that can grow without undermining the prosperity of future generations, make them more sustainable. But that's where we find at the moment the biggest barriers, not just in terms of definition, but also in terms of measurement. And that's where we are, and we need to pull forces together in order to make progress in that respect.
Okay, so that will actually be the final question. I'm sure that if you want to talk to Andrés, he will probably be in Jönköping for a couple of more days.
Yes.
You don't need to eat lunch, right? I have a little surprise for you. And the biggest surprise is that you won't get an apple.
All right, so
but you will get a hoodie.
I get a hoodie.
And you will get the two boxes, which
excellent.
I hope you can get into your suitcase.
Yes, absolutely.
And thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
And we're so happy
Thank
to
you.
have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.